And now we're going to get into The Empire Strikes Back, Part 5. At the start of 1942, the Allies had little success, and even less to be excited about. The Axis powers had defeated France and controlled virtually all the mainland of Europe. Britain had fended off invasion, but was unable to wage any serious assault of its own. The Soviets had also fended off a massive German assault, but was also unable to cause any serious harm to the Axis. And the Japanese had decimated the American Pacific Fleet. However, at the start of 1942, the tide of the war would begin to turn in favor of the Allies. In August 1942, Nazi Germany and its allies invaded the Soviet Union once again and proceeded to lay siege to the city of Stalingrad, which is Volgograd today. It was a strategic location for the Axis goal of acquiring the southern oil fields of the Soviet Union. Not to mention it had Stalin's name written all over it, making it a special prize for Germany and a symbolic city to defend for the Soviet Union. The battle was highlighted by close-quarter combat and urban warfare, making it one of the bloodiest battles in history. Once winter hit, the Soviet army surrounded the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, cutting off their supply lines. The Germans were ultimately defeated in February 1943, having exhausted their ammunition and food. In all, there were almost 2 million casualties, mostly on the Soviet side, and over 90,000 Germans were captured. Most died in captivity due to neglect and brutal treatment. The North African campaign, primarily between Germany and Britain, had begun in 1940, but came to a climax beginning in 1942 when German forces pressed toward Egypt and the Suez Canal. The German forces were led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Field Marshal was the highest rank possible in the German army. Rommel was considered to be one of the greatest generals in all of World War II, and was the most famous officer in all of Germany. He was no Nazi, and treated his captives humanely. At the end of 1942, the Germans were halted at the Egyptian city of el-Alamein, led by the British general Bernard Montgomery. Hitler and the German High Command were committed to waging a war in the vastness of Russia on the Eastern Front. The war in the desert was of minor importance to them. Had Germany dedicated more resources to the North African campaign, they could have cut off the Allied access to the Suez Canal and the rich oil fields in the Middle East and Persian Gulf region. But they didn't. Undersupplied, Rommel and the Germans retreated westward, while Montgomery and the British pushed onward after their victory at El Alamein. By late 1942, the Americans had landed in Morocco and later in Algeria in what was known as Operation Torch, under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, but was also led by one of the United States' greatest officers in the war, General George Patton. The American troops pushed onward against the Axis forces from the east, and the Axis were caught between the two Allied fronts in Tunisia. The Axis forces surrendered in May 1943, yielding over 275,000 prisoners of war. After victory by the Allies, they also gained superiority in the control of shipping in the Mediterranean Sea. Even prior to victory in North Africa, there was disagreement between the Allies on the best strategy to defeat the Axis. The Soviets demanded a second front be established to relieve the pounding they were receiving at the hands of the Germans. Stalin grumbled that the Americans and British were content in watching the communists and fascists kill each other off. Now, the Americans, and especially the Soviets, advocated a direct assault on Northern Europe. However, Churchill suggested the Allies were not ready for an all-out assault on the North just yet. He recommended they go through Italy, the soft underbelly of the Axis. If you look at Europe as you would a cloud formation, you could envision a turtle with a hard shell on top but weak underneath. Perhaps this is what Churchill was thinking as well. Nonetheless, the stage was set for the Italian campaign to begin. A combined British, Canadian, and American invasion of Sicily started in July 1943 with both amphibious and airborne landings. As hoped, Mussolini, after years of oppression, was arrested by Italian officers who secretly began to negotiate with the Allies. In early September, the Italians signed an armistice with the Allies, but the Germans stubbornly resisted against the Allied advance. And in early October, the Italians declared war on the Axis powers. The Italian campaign would rage on until the end of the war. No other campaign in Europe cost more in terms of lives lost and wounds suffered by infantry forces. In World War I, the difference between the Allied and Central Powers were not that great. However, in World War II, the fascists were clearly intent on world domination, and their political philosophy denied people any true civil rights. and the Nazis especially desired to rid the planet of the racially inferior. Which brings us to what they called the final solution to the Jewish problem. And we're talking about the Holocaust, which means destruction by fire. Jews were transported to Eastern Germany and Poland and held in what they called protective custody. Many others were deported to ghettos and camps. And some of the most infamous ones were Dachau and Buchenwald in Germany and Treblinka and Auschwitz in Poland. In addition to the ghettos and camps, the Nazis used Einsatzgruppen, which means mobile killing squads. All told, an estimated 6 million Jews were killed, as well as millions of others who were murdered, including communists, Slavs, Gypsies, and many others who the Nazis considered undesirables. Now to look at a couple main Nazi officials who were responsible for the Holocaust. One was Colonel Adolf Eichmann, who was chosen because of his organizational talents and Nazi ideological devotion. Eichmann was charged with the task of facilitating and managing the logistics of the mass deportation of Jews to ghettos and extermination camps in German-occupied Eastern Europe. The Nazis chose gas as the cheapest and most discreet way to annihilate the Jews and others they saw as racially inferior. The bodies were incinerated in industrial ovens to eradicate the evidence and prevent the spread of disease. Now once again, this is more detailed than you need to know, but the Nazis initially used carbon monoxide gas, but zyklon-b was a gas that was used to kill millions of people during the Holocaust as well. And I would be remiss not to mention Heinrich Himmler, a military commander and a leading member of the Nazi Party. He was one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, and one of the persons most directly responsible for the Holocaust. He was the head of the Schutzstaffel, a major paramilitary organization under Adolf Hitler. Himmler oversaw all internal and external police and security forces, including the Gestapo, or the secret state police. Himmler formed the Einsatzgruppen, and as the overseer of the concentration camps, Himmler was arguably the most responsible for the deaths of 11 to 14 million people. Now this was part of Hitler's master plan to establish a new order. This was the political and economic system which Nazi Germany wanted to impose on Europe, and eventually the rest of the world. Now the planning of this took place years before the start of World War II. Among other things, it entailed the creation of a German racial state ensuring the supremacy of the so-called Aryan master race. Also, the eradication of the Jews and others considered to be unworthy of life, as well as a massive territorial expansion and the domination of Eastern Europe, with the enslavement of millions of people who were regarded as racially inferior, and to use them as cheap labor. For example, the Soviet Union and Ukraine were to supply Germany with food and raw materials. And when the Germans had no more use of the people, they would kill them off. Hitler planned to establish Berlin as a new world capital called Germania, and as you can see with the scale model, he had big plans ahead of him. The only ones that stood in the way of total Nazi domination of Europe, and perhaps the world, were the armies of the Allies. If they were to fail, the world would fall into a period of darkness perhaps never seen before in history.
Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey. Hello, my ragtime gal. Send me a kiss by wire. Baby, my heart's on fire. If you refuse me, honey, you lose me. Then you'll be left alone. Oh, baby, telephone and tell me I'm your own.
Check, please.